Hey everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we will explore and learn Hibernate's first level cache. In Hibernate, there are first level cache and second level cache. We will cover second level cache in another video. In this video, we will simply focus on the first level caching. Before we start, there are two things which, if you know, will help you understand better, and these are the concept of persistence context and transactions. I have covered both of them in the previous video, so you can find the link in the description. So let's start by understanding what is the first level cache. The first level cache in JPA or Hibernate is a session scoped cache that stores entities loaded during the session. Notice the entities are loaded or stored only during the session, and here the session is Hibernate session, and when we talk about the JPA, this is called entity manager. So this cache is a session scoped cache. That means it is only active when the session is active. Once we close the session, the corresponding cache will also be disposed. So we can utilize the first level cache only for the duration of the session. And within the boundary of that session, whatever entities we are creating, persisting or updating, those will be stored in that cache. This is the first level cache. Now, second thing is this cache is mandatory. That means we cannot disable it. JPA or Hibernate will always store the entities in the persistence context or in this first level cache. So before we run the application and understand what's going on, let's quickly review the project that we have. So this is a very simple project. In the application.yml file, we have provided the data source and the shows equivalent ddl-auto. This is the entity. It is a very simple entity reminder which has only two columns, the primary key and the title. We have a very simple repository, Spring Data repository. And we have a service as well. Here we are auto-wiring the repository and the entity manager factory. But so far we are only using the entity manager factory. And in this method, we are creating two instances of entity manager. You can consider it as a Hibernate session. So this is equivalent to Hibernate session. So this is Hibernate session 1, you can say. And this is Hibernate session 2. So from the entity manager factory, we are creating a new entity manager. Then from the entity manager, you get the transaction and start that transaction. You do some job, and once we are done, we are closing or committing the transaction, and we are closing the entity manager. So that will close the session. And similarly, we are creating a new entity manager. That is the session number 2. We are doing a similar thing, starting the transaction, doing something with the database, and then committing the transaction and closing the entity manager. And if you check the main class here in the application runner bean, we are simply injecting the reminder service and calling the cache demo method, which is this one. Now, within the boundary of the transaction for both the entity manager sessions, what we are doing, we are reading the reminder entity for the primary key 1. That means we are reading the same record. So we have two sessions and we are reading the same record. When we run the application, let's see what happens. Here in the logs, you can see the log message which says second level cache disabled. Because second level cache is optional, so by default it is disabled, but we don't see anything similar for the first level cache. It is mandatory. Now coming to the execution, here you see for the first call, which is this one, we see the Hibernate triggered a select query to read the record from the database. And for the first call, we see the object that we are printing here. Then after the separator for the second call, because we are trying to read the same entity, we see Hibernate triggered the query again for the same record. So the thing is, when we have two sessions, as we understand, the first level cache is a session scoped cache. That means it only works within the boundary of a particular session or when we are working with the entity manager. But as we can see here, we have two sessions here. We are creating a new entity manager and closing it. And then we are creating a new entity manager. So because there are two sessions, we are not utilizing the first level cache. Hibernate will only store the entity within the boundary of a particular session, and here this is not the case. And so that's why even though we are reading the same entity, Hibernate is triggering the same SQL 2 times. So let's refactor this code and try to utilize the first level cache. For that, I will create a new method. I will leave it as it is because I will be committing the code. So this is there for the reference. We will now try to use the first level cache using Entity Manager. So what we need to do is we need to keep the session active. We need to keep the Entity Manager open. So first of all, we don't need to close this one. I can remove it. And second, we have to work with the existing Entity Manager with the existing session. So we don't need to create a new Entity Manager using Entity Manager Factory. So I can remove this one as well. And we will use the same Entity Manager, which is Entity Manager 1, like this. So what we are doing now is we created a new Entity Manager here. Then we are starting a new transaction, reading the record from the database and committing the transaction. Then after some time, we start another transaction on the same Entity Manager. So that means on the same session, we are starting a new transaction, reading the record from the database and then committing the second transaction. And then in the end, we are closing the Entity Manager. So now we have a single Entity Manager, and with the help of a single Entity Manager, we are reading the record twice, the same record twice. Let's rerun the code. And we still see the same output because I forgot to call this method from the main class. Okay. So here if we check the logs for the first call, when we are reading the record for the first time, it triggered a select query like this. And it will fetch the record, but it will also store the record in the first level cache, which is the Entity Manager's persistence context. Then we have the separator, and for the second call this time, we only see the entity. We don't see the query triggered by the Hibernate. And the reason behind this is we are now using the first level cache. We are using the same Entity Manager. So within the scope of a session, we are now using the first level cache. And this time Hibernate will check the first level cache, the persistence context, and it will see it has the entity already present in the persistence context for the same primary key. So it will not go to the database, it will simply return the entity from the cache. And that's why we don't see the query triggered by the Hibernate this time for the second call. We only see the entity. So this time we got the entity from the cache. Now this is the first level cache of Hibernate. Notice we have to work with the same Entity Manager. We have to work with the same session in order to utilize the first level cache. So this is simple stuff. Mostly we work with Entity Manager when we are dealing with the first level cache or maybe second level cache. Now we will see how do we utilize the first level cache when we are using Spring Data repository, because when we are using Spring Data JPA, most of the time we use repositories like this reminder repository. So we'll create a new method and we'll try to use the first level cache using Spring Data repository. For that, let me write a new method. And here because we already have the repository, so what I can do, I can simply call the find method to read the record. Long dot value of 1 dot get, and then we will print the record. Then for the second call, we will read the same record again from the database. And don't forget to call this method like this. So what we're doing, it's a very simple method call. We are simply using the repository and we're calling find by ID to read the record by ID from the database. And we are calling the repository's find by ID method twice in the same method call. So essentially we are reading the same record twice. Let's run the application first. And this time we see for the first call, we see a select query, then we see the record, what we have printed here. And for the second call as well, we see the select query and the same record. So what is happening when we are using the Spring Data repository, we are reading the same record within the same method, but we see the query being triggered twice. So here when we use the Spring Data repository, we don't have direct access to Entity Manager. How do we handle the first level cache then? How do we utilize the first level cache then when we don't have direct access to the Entity Manager? So to better understand the Spring Data repository flow, let's first enable some logging so that we can see what's going on behind the scene, so that we can understand what to do with the Spring Data repository in order to use the first level cache. So we will go to the application.yaml file, and there are a couple of properties that we need to enable, and these properties are related to logging level. So let me quickly copy the properties that we need to put here. And these properties are logging level, and here we are configuring or changing the log level of three packages, which are org.springframework.orm.jpa. Then one is from Hibernate event.internal, and the last one is also from Hibernate internal.session.impl. Once we enable the logging for these three packages, we will be able to see what's going on behind the scene, how Spring Data repository handles the transactions and the session or the entity manager. So with this logging enabled, let's run the same application again, and this time we will see what's going on. So this time we see a lot more information in the log. First of all, let's start with the first call. Then it prints the first call. Now, when we call the find by ID method, what it does, it will create a new transaction. It will open a new session. It will open a new entity manager. So this is important. When we use Spring Data repository will handle the underlying transaction, session, and entity manager automatically. We only have a certain level of control over that. So here we see for a single find by ID method call, it is creating the transaction, session, and entity manager. Then it will try to load the entity reminder, which is this one. And then it attempts to resolve the entity. But you can see here the log message says object not resolved in any cache. So here Hibernate is trying to find the entity in first level cache or the second level cache. Second level cache is disabled. So there is only first level cache, and it could not find the object in any cache. So what it will do, it will simply trigger the select query to fetch the record from the database. And once it does that, we see it has committed the transaction and the session will be closed. And then we see the log message that we have printed, which is this one. And similarly for the second call, it will create the new transaction, a new session, a new entity manager. It will again attempt to resolve the entity, but because this is a new transaction, a new entity manager, a new session, so it will have its own cache. We know the first level cache is a session scoped cache, and that's why this time it will not find the object in any cache. And so it will trigger the same query again. It will again commit the transaction, close the entity manager, and close the session. So what we need to understand from this example is that Spring Data repositories methods handle the transaction, session, and entity manager automatically. And that's why in this example, for the two method calls, each method call has its own transaction, its own session and entity manager, and hence its own first level cache. That's why these two method calls are not sharing the cache, and hence we see the query running twice. So how do we use the first level cache in this scenario when we are using Spring Data repository? Now that we understand what's going on behind the scene in the logs, how do we solve this? Well, the key thing here is for a transaction, it is opening a new session and an entity manager. So what if somehow we share the transaction? What if we run both the calls within the boundary of a single transaction? Will it create a single session entity manager and a single first level cache? Let's see that. Now the thing is, we already know this, how to call multiple calls in a single transaction. We know how to do it. We have a method here, first level cache with repository. All we need to do is we need to put @transactional annotation here, and that will make this method call a transactional call. So all these calls will be executed within the boundary of a single transaction. And we saw how Spring Data JPA handles the entity manager and the transaction when we called find by ID. So in this case, because these things are automatically managed by Spring, when we put the transactional annotation on a method, it will create a single boundary of a transaction. And so Spring will manage the entity manager accordingly. That means there will be a single entity manager for this method. So this time, if we run the application, so let's start from the start. And here we see for the first call what it did. It actually created a new transaction for the method first level cache with repository, which is this one. So it created a new transaction, then it opened a new session. After that, it is opening a new entity manager. And then when it calls the find by ID method for the first call, we see instead of creating a new transaction, this time Spring Data repository is participating in the existing transaction. Here it is reusing the existing transaction. And so there is no new transaction, there is no new entity manager. Now we are sharing the same transaction and the same entity manager. And after that, it is trying to load the entity, it is trying to find the entity in the cache. Because for the first call, there will be no entity in the cache. So we see the select query and the entity in the logs. Now for the second call, it will not create a new transaction. It will again reuse the same transaction and the same entity manager. So that means for the second call, we are now sharing the entity manager. And by sharing the entity manager, we are also sharing the first level cache. And so this time, when it tries to load the entity, when it tries to resolve the entity, this time it will find the entity in the first level cache. And so we don't see a query this time, but it was able to resolve the entity in the cache. And after completing everything, it is here committing the transaction, closing the entity manager, flashing the session, and all that. So by using transactions, we can use the first level cache when we are using Spring Data repository. And there is one more thing that we need to cover is, if you notice, when we are using transactions and the first level cache, Hibernate does the dirty checking as well. Let's quickly see what does it do. The good thing is now we know how we can utilize the first level cache using transactions. And with the help of transaction for the second Spring Data call, we were actually able to use the first level cache. Now for the dirty checking part, I can comment this one. Instead of this, what we can do, let's update the entity. We know within the boundary of a single session, there is this first level cache active. And so this entity is in the cache. We saw it in the logs. Now the entity is in the cache. What if we update the entity? So on the Java side, we are simply updating the entity same as any other object. By calling the setter method, we are updating the property. So let's say in the logs, the title of the reminder was to do something, and we update it to do something 1. And notice we are not doing anything else. We are not explicitly closing the session. We are not explicitly flushing anything. We are simply updating the entity within the method, and this method is transactional. Now if we rerun the application, we see it completes successfully. And if we check the database, so this is the reminder table, and we can see the update happened in the database. The new title is to do something 1. So what that means is, by simply updating the property on the Java side, the update was triggered on the DB as well. So let's see what happened in the logs. So first of all, for the first call, we know it will create a new transaction, a new entity manager, and then it will trigger the select query because the entity is not in the cache. But at this point of time, it will be stored in the first level cache. Now for the second call, because we are still in the same session, we are still in the same method call, which is we are still using the same transaction. What we have done, we have updated the entity. Now what will happen when this method call completes? Spring has to commit the transaction, and when it commits the transaction, it will flush the session automatically. Whenever we are committing the transaction, we are automatically flushing as well. So when it flushes this session, it applies the dirty checking. In the dirty checking, it checks the status of those entities which are stored in the persistence context or in the first level cache. If it finds any change, it will try to sync those changes to the database. And that's exactly what is happening here. So it found a dirty property for the reminder entity, and that dirty property is title because we changed the title here. This is different from the entity which is available in the first level cache. So there is a mismatch now. In the cache, the entity has the title to do something, but on the Java side, as we changed it to -1, it will see that this property is dirty. So Hibernate knows it has to update the entity, and we can see that here as well. Here in the stats, you see it found one update. And so it will try to sync the update. It will try to sync the entity from the cache or from the persistence context to the database. And that's why we see an update query here on the reminder table where it is updating the title of that record. And that's why we see the updated value in the database. So that is the dirty checking property. Within the scope of a session, if we are changing the entity, it will be automatically flushed and the changes will be synced to the database, because Hibernate will trigger the update queries automatically. And in the end, it closes the entity manager and it closes the session. And notice it is also closing the entity manager factory. So when we use Spring Data JPA, we don't explicitly create the entity manager factory. It's already available to us. So that's pretty much it on the first level cache. We saw how to use first level cache using entity manager. And most importantly, we saw how can we reuse first level cache using Spring Data repositories by making the methods transactional. So that's all for now. See you in the next video. Thanks for watching.